our mileage out of the Green Onions. We have on in line with us now Grace Ross. Good morning, Grace. How are you?
I'm good.
A little variety, spring green onions. I didn't think you'd mind. Give the motorcycle a rest this morning.
You're reaching for it this morning, David.
Oh, we always are reaching for it. Anyway, so we are recording this for camera. This is going to be on television too. We're going to get some pictures of you. Whatever.
I already sent pictures of me.
You did? Oh wow.
Yeah, Dan should have everything.
Oh, all right. Well, what is on our minds this morning?
Well, I thought since we were going to have show and tell,
okay,
that we should really talk about the ever-evolving information we have about what the banks did illegally with the foreclosures.
Yes. Great.
So, when I try and talk to folks about what happened, right, where was the real violation? The public story is that the real violation was the subprime mortgages, right? These were bad mortgages, and they were unfair, and they were expensive, among other things. And the thing is that was the mechanism that the financial industry used to hook a whole bunch of people into mortgages that they couldn't afford. And because of the way that they were incentivizing getting these mortgages to people, how they were paying the brokers, they created this huge pressure to increase property values.
Now,
and so,
excuse me, can I interrupt just a moment? Didn't a part of this come about because of home equity loans? In other words, if we increase the value of your home, that means you can borrow more money from it. Am I off base on that?
Yes, but what mattered was, when it was your mother's mortgage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go back 30 years.
Okay.
When you go back 30 years, the employees were paid for every mortgage they closed. It didn't matter how much the mortgage was worth. The incentivizing that happened here was that normally, why would a bank want to lend you more money than you could afford, right? I mean, that's not in the interest of the bank. But what they did here was they were paying the brokers per dollar that they got you to borrow. So the more money they got you to borrow, the more the broker got paid. Now, the broker had no ongoing skin in the game. If they gave you a mortgage that you couldn't afford, didn't matter for them. They got their fee. They were out. He
was getting a fatter commission out of the whole deal.
Exactly. So they got extra money every time so if you came in and you said, I've saved up, I've got $20,000 to put down on the house, they made more money if they could get you to put down $15,000 or $10,000 instead of the $20,000. And they made more money when you bought more house. So it's not that people bought more house than they could afford, consciously sort of went, this is a reach, but I'm going to do it. There's probably a few people who did that, but mostly everybody wants to buy a home they can afford for the next 30 years, right? They're signing a contract they figure they've got to pay on for 30 years. The broker, on the other hand, was making money every time the prices went up. So one of the things that we know, and there was an extensive pushback on this, was that the appraisers were getting pressured to increase the appraised value of the home. So that you would, the broker would have a house that had been appraised at, $240,000, and they would call the appraiser back and say, go back out. I really need this at $260,000. And we know this was happening, among other things, because the appraisers complained about it. In 2006, 1,100 appraisers whose livelihood depended on the banks who were doing the mortgaging wrote a petition to the federal agency that oversees things like appraisers and told the federal agency that there was so much pressure on appraisers to increase the value that you could not rely on an appraisal anymore as accurately reflecting the value of a home. So they endangered their individual businesses and their field because they were so concerned that appraisals didn't mean anything anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how much pressure was going on. That's what inflates the housing bubble, and it's the housing bubble that got us into trouble. The subprime mortgages alone would have been bad for the folks who got them, but it was the overpricing that killed people. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I gave Dan was my favorite graph of the housing bubble that compares home ownership costs to rental costs, which, since they had been tracking it, I think since the 60s, I'd have to go check that, those amounts had always run in a particular ratio to each other, slightly bumping up and down, but basically along a straight line. And starting in 2002, home ownership costs start skyrocketing. And we see them skyrocket until shortly before the market crashes, right? Because they crash, and that crashes the world market. Mm-hmm. Why that matters is that what happened was the thing that got people into trouble and got plenty of folks who had prime mortgages who weren't, funneled into a subprime mortgage. Many people who got subprime mortgages should have had prime mortgages anyway. Again, because brokers were incentivized to give subprime mortgages. They got more money if they got David Tierney into a subprime mortgage than a prime mortgage, even if it was for the same amount of money. The bubble meant that you could have put down 20% on a piece of property, but if you purchased during the bubble, that money went into thin air because the property wasn't worth that much. When the property values crashed, of course, the banks didn't say, "Oh, let's back off on the mortgage because we overpriced the mortgage." No, they let the crash eat up the money you had put down. So tons of folks who were then in prime mortgages and who had put down the standard traditional 20% or the more recent, somewhat traditional 10% were just out of luck. They had no equity left. In fact, they were in negative equity. The reason this was all brought to my attention again was because now, as we had predicted, the banks are beginning to sue each other for having lied about the value of these mortgages. When we went in front of the legislature, 3 or 4 years ago, the title insurers kept saying, "Well, yeah, there are issues with the foreclosures, ruining people's title, clouding it, as they call it. But it doesn't matter because it's only going to be a problem for the new purchaser down the line." Uh-huh. Well, of course, it's a problem for the person whose home was illegally taken, but it turns out that the banks are suing each other. So I was reading a lawsuit between Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac under their parent organization, FHFA, against one of the companies that set up a bunch of these securitized trusts, Nomura. And for folks who don't remember, the securitized trust is where they took all thousands of mortgages, bundled them together into a trust so that they could then essentially sell stocks and bonds in the trust at the stock exchange and get investors to pay for all these mortgages instead of the banks having to do it out of their own pocket. Anyway, FHFA sued and won against Nomura for selling them as investors these trusts. And a chunk of what they talk about is not what the appraised value was when the mortgage was gotten, but what the real value of the property was. Mm-hmm. So they had one of their experts go reappraise all of these properties from at the time period when the mortgage was originated, and figured out that the appraisals, the formal, supposedly legal appraisals of these properties, were way overvalued, which meant that people got mortgages that were over the value of the property to begin with, which of course means you're underwater to begin with. It means you're starting out, in negative land, which means you can't sell the place from day one. You couldn't refinance it from day one because it wasn't worth what they claimed it was worth.
Well, that whole thing right there just seems to be highly illegal.
Totally illegal.
Oh, okay.
Completely illegal. There's no question about it. But we need the experts. I need a team of realtors who are willing to put some time in to go back in time to a particular time period and reappraise these properties for what they actually were worth.
Have you found any such honest people?
Well, that's the thing is we know there were hundreds and thousands of honest appraisers who went out of business because they wouldn't lie. A number of whom, wrote this petition to the Federal Oversight Committee. But this is the core issue, because when we go into court or we talk to a legislator, and actually I think when people listen to what's in their own head, they have this nagging feeling that as an individual they blew it because the appraised amount was X and they should have been able to afford this mortgage. That's what they were told by someone they thought was an expert, the broker, the rep from the bank, whoever. They blame themselves. The courts blame them. Policymakers blame them by saying, well, you bought too much house. Well, if our local person who doesn't have, doesn't know the market, doesn't have a degree in this stuff, doesn't work in this area, or maybe works in the area but isn't high enough in the food chain, they didn't realize that the prices were being illegally ramped up. And the appraisal they were given was one of these inflated appraisals. So they couldn't make an informed decision about whether this was the real value of the home or not. But the real kicker is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who are the largest players in the mortgaging industry in the United States, they didn't figure it out at the time either. They couldn't figure it out, and they have more resources than any of us would ever have. They have researchers, they can hire lawyers, they have, all of these resources. They've got the government, supposedly, as a resource behind them. They couldn't figure it out. So how is it possible that one of our local folks who got tied into one of these overpriced homes somehow is being held accountable for not knowing what was going on? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac didn't know what was going on. They're only figuring it out after the fact, right? This lawsuit I was reading, I think, started in late 2011 or something. So they didn't figure it out until we're way past the bubble. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like we're living in this la-la land where to the benefit of the financial industry and a few other folks, there's this lie going on, blaming the people of the United States for not knowing stuff that the only folks who knew was the industry who had created this mess. And even Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who underwrite 50 to 60% of all mortgages, they hadn't figured it out. So the thing is that we've got to get the story told right, because without it being told right, people think it's their own individual fault, so they don't fight when their rights are violated. As you said, that has to be illegal. Of course it's illegal. But they don't know it. Too many of the policymakers still haven't figured out what the real underlying problem was, the housing bubble, and the industry didn't. And folks need to remember that when the market crash happened, and Greenspan, who was chair of the Fed but had retired shortly before the market crash, got dragged back into Congress as the former Fed chair and gets asked, what was going on here? Greenspan was hailed as this amazing economic guru who, kept the economy in good shape for, I don't know how long he was supposedly in office.
Why? Primarily because whenever he said something, most people couldn't figure out what he was saying.
Well, but also he oversaw several bubbles that weren't real value that was being created, right? We had the whole .com computer bubble, and just as that was dying down, and there should have been, a bad market consequence to that, the housing bubble had just started. And so, we were insulated from one bad and probably illegal market bubble by the inflation of a new one that was way bigger and way more dangerous. And Greenspan, when he gets called in front of Congress, says, well, we missed it. Sorry. Actually, all our equations are off. He basically threatened the entire way that the Fed in general has thought about the economy. And there was this huge flurry for about 3 weeks of everybody panicking that Greenspan said all of the equations that the Fed had been using were questionable. And then it went away as if he hadn't said it. But the critical piece for the housing bubble thing is that the chart that I gave Dan to show folks, the comparison between rents and home prices, which is the Case-Shiller Index. The really critical thing there was that the guy I got that from was a researcher from the Boston Federal Reserve. I got it from him initially, I think, in 2007, before the chart you guys have is more recent than that. But he said, we saw this anomaly, this, historic thing that had never happened before, and we thought, wow, that's weird. He said, but then we stuck it in a drawer because we couldn't explain it. So they knew, the Fed researchers knew, the ones who this is their area of responsibility, knew that there was this bizarre housing bubble happening. They had no explanation for it. Very clearly, they had not passed it up the food chain to be, taken seriously and have the Fed think about what this means. Everybody just looked the other way. And I shouldn't say everybody, because these appraisers were already complaining in 2003 about what was happening. And the FBI in 2004 said that they saw more bank fraud than they'd seen in a long time, and they were very worried that the amount of bank fraud that was being reported to them would make the S&L bailout, I think they literally said these words, looked like a walk in the park. And so this was very serious. It impacted everybody's lives. And what the real fight is about, what the financial industry is, why the financial industry is jumping up and down on homeowners and trying to make sure that nobody wins in court and that the real story doesn't get out, is because they don't want to have to pay for the housing bubble that they created and they benefited from. They want to put the responsibility on the individual homeowners and let our people be destroyed financially, their extended families, the communities we live in, et cetera, rather than take responsibility and, of course, have to eat the profits that they shouldn't have gotten. They were in and out so fast, I can't tell you. I mean, the loans that Fannie and Freddie buy, they appear to get them within a month or two of the origination of the mortgage. The private label trusts that were set up to compete with Fannie and Freddie, these toxic assets as they got called during the TARP argument in Congress, those get the mortgages within 3 months usually of when they're written. So all of, not just the brokers, but the companies that hired the brokers, the mortgage companies, the now big banks, et cetera, they were in and out also. Mm-hmm. Their financial commitment was only for 1, 2, 3 months. They were gone after that. Their name stays on the mortgage because they pick up the contract to bill you and do the other things that are called servicing the loan when they sell it to Fannie or Freddie or when they sell it to the trust. So they don't bother to change their name in the registry of deeds. They still claim to be the mortgagee, to have the mortgage. But they don't. They're just servicing a contract. They have no skin in the game. Doesn't matter for them. They made their money up front, sold it off. And, of course, if Fannie and Freddie bought it, we, the people of the United States, are the guarantor for Fannie and Freddie. So we end up paying for it in the long run, too. But the folks who made fast money were these brokers, who, of course, are relatively little fish, and then the big financial interests. They made all the money up front, and then they sold it off. And they sold off the debt, and they sold off the liability, which is why FHFA is now suing various of these trust originators who they bought from. But this is the travesty, and the travesty is huge. In this one lawsuit that I was reading the decision on, they say that between, I think it was 2005 and 2007, almost $3 trillion of mortgages were inserted into these supposed trusts. That's our money. Mm-hmm. That's trillions of our money, of regular people's money. And they inserted them into these trusts, probably all of it not done according to law. And now we're supposed to hold the bag on it. And what it's done is destroyed our lives, our communities. If you think of money as sort of a measure of the lifeblood of a community, it's as if, we have these vampires who've drained all the blood out of our communities. And, there's no money to hire an extra worker or, spend an extra buck at a local coffee shop. I haven't seen a lifestyle report in the last, year maybe. But the reports were showing that, people don't go out to dinner like they used to. They don't go out to the movies. They don't take the kids for, to buy an extra toy or whatever. And it's this constant drain because there's no money. We don't have money to spend. And it was because it was taken from us, and this is how it was taken. It turns out that, and I'm not going to get this year right either, I need to check it, but between 2002 and I think it was 2007, the income of the top 1% grew 10 times faster than the rest of us. And that's because whatever money we were making that was, slightly improving our lives, and most of us didn't actually experience an improvement in our standard of living at all between 2002 and 2007. They were taking all of that money. They, gave people overpriced mortgages, so they were just draining it out of people's pockets before people ever hit a foreclosure. And that's where the money came from. It came from us, and a lot of it from our costs on housing and probably medical care. And it went straight up to the very wealthiest. I mean, there was already an income gap that had been growing since, it would have been mid-70s, maybe late 70s. But it took off. The income gap just exponentially widened during that time period. So folks need to understand, this is the largest wealth grab. It was a larger wealth divide now than leading into the Great Depression. The housing value loss when the market crashed was greater than the Great Depression. And the amount of money the top folks managed, somebody recently said to me, well, this is what happened in the Great Depression. This is not what happened in the Great Depression, because coming out of the Great Depression, the way the economy came back was that all sorts of policies were put in place that basically economically pushed the very wealthiest back towards the rest of us and improved the rest of our living standard overall as people. And that is not at all what happened this time. We had hoped that the folks that Obama had appointed, for instance, to the Fed, the Federal Reserve, were folks who were Depression economists, and we thought, oh, thank God, maybe they're going to handle it well. Well, no, all they did was decide that they were going to protect the banks so the banks didn't get shut down like they did during the Great Depression. Otherwise, they let the rest of us just whatever. And what it meant was none of the policy things that happened that fixed the economy for the vast majority of people, and therefore also for wealthy people, because we had our most productive economy between whatever it was, 1950 and 1970. None of those things are what the policymakers at the top have done. Instead, they've gone the other direction, which was to protect the marble halls of the biggest banks.
Grace, on that note, I think we're going to need to wrap up.
Really?
Well,
okay.
I mean, what we're doing is we're planning about a half-hour piece for television, and I think I've kind of lost. I have to admit, I've a little bit lost track of time here, but I think we've gone to a half hour. We'll probably have enough for a program.
22 minutes, I think it's been.
Okay,
all right.
We'll keep going then.
I can tell you.
Thank you.
I could tell you exactly how long it's been. You want me to check?
Yeah, no, go ahead. I believe you. I believe you. You're not a banker. Well, I believe you.
You believe me. Well, so, I mean, I guess my point is, and I will wrap up, I guess my point is this. We have now, especially as the banks are suing each other and all sorts of stuff is coming out, we now know for sure the legal steps people can take from pretty much any foreclosure that has happened, or if they're threatened with foreclosure, to stop the banks from taking the homes or to reverse the foreclosures that have happened. We literally have the legal arguments ready to go. We know where to sue. We know how to do it. It's about people getting back in. They've got to step beyond the shame, and it behooves all of us. These were not individual attacks. These were attacks on our local economies, on our communities, and they just picked off particular people to do that attack. Mm-hmm. But it was our entire financial well-being at the community level. And so people need to look to their friends, their family members, the folks who moved suddenly that you don't know why they moved. They were ashamed and they didn't tell you, but it was probably because of a foreclosure. We've got to reach those people, tell the real story, make it clear to them that even Fannie and Freddie have now admitted how it was done and what happened, and that it wasn't their individual fault, and there was no way they could have known what they were getting gotten into illegally by the lenders.
Grace,
we can turn it around.
Grace, are you going to, having said what you just said, are you going to come out with a sort of an instructive pamphlet or video about this, the steps that people can take?
We need to put out a bunch of videos to explain both what happened and to give people the tools to begin to fight back, so that even though they may, they definitely need support to do it. A fair number of folks might need lawyers, although a lot of folks are suing on their own, and as we get good materials together, they'll win. But people need to learn enough to understand what happened and to guide their lawyer and to know what they're fighting for, even if they hire a lawyer. So, yeah, we have to do a bunch of videos. We're working on automating our legal intake forms so that people will be able to fill them in themselves and, figure out what legal documents they need to put their hands on. The real issue, though, is for people to come together and back each other. You got gotten because we're like a herd of gazelle, and what the lions do is wait for who falls away from the herd, and that's who they get. So the way you fix something is to reverse what happened. So if you got picked off because you isolated and they made you feel like it was your fault, you have to reverse that and join in with others. Work your way through the shame, recognize that the shame belongs to those who gave these illegal mortgages and made trillions of dollars off of them with no conscience at all. And get back involved. If you're interested, people who are interested, track this stuff on our website, www.maapl.info, INFO, or you can call or fax us at 508-630-1686. But it's really going to be about getting together with your neighbors. We'll help you do that. We'll help people build the support teams to back themselves. But we have to bring these trillions of dollars back to the people of the United States, and we know how to do it. And it's just a question of will at this point, that we're going to come together and make it happen.
Grace, if you need a studio to do this, to put these together, you can come to us.
Well, I will probably take you up on that partly.
We're counting on it. Well, thank you very much.
No problem. And just remind folks that it's when we stand with each other that we build the communities and the future we want.
All right. Thank you very much.
Have a good week, everybody.
All righty.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.